Good morning and afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for joining ZL's third webinar on the Don't Be Afraid of the Dark series. Today's topic is addressing data security with file analysis. My name is Fareed Vij, Director of Information Governance here at ZL Technologies. And I'm very happy to be moderating today's webinar where we have three panelists with us. So we have three great panelists joining us today that I'd like to introduce to everyone on the phone. First and foremost, Roberta Anderson. Roberta is a partner at K&L Gates in Pittsburgh. She's a co-founder of the firm's Cybersecurity, Privacy, and Data Protection Practice Group and a member of the firm's Insurance Coverage Practice Group. Roberta's got extensive experience on cybersecurity and data privacy related issues, and we're very pleased to have her joining us today. Together with her is Jennifer Mylander, who is the Associate General Counsel and Director of Compliance and Privacy at Corporation Service Company. Jennifer is an expert in negotiating commercial contracts, dealing with issues around corporate governance, compliance, security, and privacy. She also serves as the Secretary of the ACC Council of Committees and was previously the Chair of the Litigation Committee. Jen, thanks very much for joining us today. And finally, we have Linda Sharp, who's the Associate General Counsel at ZL Technologies. Linda has spent the better part of 3 decades in the information governance and e-discovery industry with extensive experience working with Fortune 500 entities as well as federal and state agencies around various issues surrounding e-discovery, information governance, data privacy, and security. Linda brings a very interesting perspective, having consulted as an attorney as well as being on the technology side. So that rounds up our panelists today. Everyone, thanks very much for joining us. So moving real quick to the agenda for today. So what we're going to start with is what we're calling Section 1, Reality of Data Breaches. We're going to walk through a few different data breaches that we've seen over the last couple of years, what the impact has been of those data breaches, and really how they've come about to sort of set the stage on how companies can best prepare themselves to handle a data breach or a cybersecurity issue. Next, we're going to talk about, what do we really consider to be sensitive information? What is this data that we need to secure, that we need to govern, that we need to make sure it is into the hands of hackers or have an employee walk out of the organization with, or whatever the case might be. And then finally, what are some of the move forward strategies and takeaways that our experts can provide to you as you look at your cybersecurity and data governance programs within your organizations. Just for a little bit of background on this webinar series, Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, this has really been a 3-part series focused on the first session was focused on how do we actually get buy-in within the organization and who are the key stakeholders that we need to involve when we're coming up with a comprehensive data security, cybersecurity and governance program. The second session was really around what are some of the low-hanging fruits. What can we start looking at today, both from a technology and data perspective, to actually address some of these issues. And again, today's session is to really tie in some of the security and data breach aspects to the broader concept of governance, where a lot of the focus for organizations today has been on the security side. How do we make sure that we're securing our firewall, we're securing our data within the organization, but not only looking at it from an information technology perspective, but also from a data governance, privacy, and e-discovery perspective. So with that, I think we'll get started with our first topic, which is really the reality of data breaches. Here what we wanted to really introduce was not only talking about, when we talk about data breaches, we're always looking at securing our firewall, making sure that external perpetrators can't get to the data within our organization. But one of the things that we wanted to bring to light and make sure we talk about today is internal data breaches. What are we doing internally to make sure employees, whether maliciously or through negligence, don't inadvertently expose confidential data or get access to data that they shouldn't have. So with that, we'll go into a few of the data breaches that we've seen over the last couple of years. And Jen, maybe I'll ask you to sort of jump in here and maybe speak to a couple of these. Obviously, a lot of these have been in the news, but I think there might be a couple interesting stories you might be able to share around a couple of these breaches.
Well, thank you. Hello, Fareed. It's a pleasure to join today. Thank you so much. And as you had identified, the slide that we're looking at now really talks about some of the highlight or significant cyber attacks that have occurred over the past 12 to 24 months. And, you know, sadly, there are more that we could probably add to this slide, but, you know, we have a certain number of minutes on this presentation today. But so I wanted to first start talking about Sony, which caught my attention after I read an article in Fortune magazine that was, I recommend the article, it gives the entire story about what had happened at Sony many months ago, November 24th, 2014. It was a Monday. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning and Pacific time, and Sony employees began logging into their desktop computers, probably like they had every day, you know, for the previous year, and were surprised that popped up on most of their screens was a very scary, threatening red skeleton-like thing. And they heard gunfire coming out of the computer, and literally within an hour, the hackers' malware systematically jumped from computer to computer across the globe, wiping out, you know, literally half of Sony's global network. It erased everything stored on over 3,000 of the company's personal computers and more than 800 of their 1,500 servers. So it was devastating to them. They were, you know, some of the impacts that things like this you just don't even think about, but they were reduced to writing paper checks to pay their employees. They were using fax machines to actually communicate with one another. The hackers actually also stole company data and then posted that data on public file sharing sites, and it included, you know, draft movie scripts. There were emails, highly sensitive emails, as you can imagine, salary lists, and more than 47,000 Social Security numbers were stolen as well. And so, you know, Sony claimed that it was very, very well prepared for this, for a cybersecurity threat, and that really, in their mind, they were the victim of one of the worst cyber attacks in U.S. history, because in this case, it was ultimately found, you know, to be a hack that was implemented by a foreign government, North Korea. Now, security experts are not sure that they really agree with Sony's take on this, and really cite more frequently to their what's perceived as very lax security. You know, and an example of it is they had an email system, but they didn't even require two-factor authentication. And just to make sure we're on the same page, you know, this is a standard technology that many of us use today that basically requires two forms of identity to log in. So, you know, something you have like your cell phone or perhaps a token, as well as something you know, your username and your password. You know, prior to that, in 2011, they'd had over 20 hacks. So they definitely had a history of you know, particularly being in the technology industry, of being attacked. Now, what's really interesting, and this is one of those things you really need to be careful about what you say in life. In 2007, Sony's Director of Information Security, Jason Spaltro, told CIO Magazine, quote, "I will not invest $10 million to avoid a possible $1 million loss." And he argued that that was reasonable because it was ultimately, in his mind, a business decision to accept the risk of a security breach. Now, granted, 2007 seems like eons ago, and you know, you didn't have the number of breaches like that we see just on the screen in front of us, but I think that really sets the tone for sort of the attitude about security. And it's indicative, I think, of their culture and not taking security seriously. Linda?
Thank you, Jen. No, and it's very interesting, the Sony example, obviously very, very well publicized, and you know, I think from a lot of the folks that have actually looked into it, it's really interesting to see that it's a lot of the data that was insecure, that wasn't successfully secured within the organization that caused most of the damage, as opposed to, you know, the initial data that, you know, the hackers actually got to. But no, Jen, thanks very much for sharing that perspective. Linda, did you want to add anything as far as Sony or looking at a couple of these other breaches?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So one of the other things to kind of keep in mind as we look at Sony, and I obviously don't want to be, you know, a dead horse here, but the reality of it is a lot of the data that was they were able to gain access to. Unfortunately, organization really shouldn't have had that data anymore. A considerable amount of the information was employees' personal type data that was sitting out in the environment. And obviously, if they'd had a sound governance policy, that information may no longer have actually even existed in their environment. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind as we walk through this process today. A couple of other ones I did want to bring some light to. One of them was the Ashley Madison matter. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this, but this is a website. In fact, it was a website that encouraged adultery. And an organization out there called the Impact Team gained access to the environment and advised them that if they did not take the site down immediately or given a specific time period, that they were going to distribute information regarding the 37 million members of that particular organization. Now, we don't really know exactly how they gained access. However, two specific individuals, the CEO, Noel Bitterman, indicated that he believed it had something to do with a former contract employee. And then John McAfee of McAfee Security fame indicated or theorized that he felt that it was probably an internal employee that was able to allow that access to occur. So as we're looking at how we're going to provide better security processes, we really need to do a great job about making sure that we're educating our employees, that we're shoring up our firewalls, and we're making it harder for these events to occur. Another couple that I wanted to bring to attention is, we can talk all about, making sure that we protect our credentials. But I have to tell you, it's amazing to me how even still today, I'll walk into an office or I'll be meeting with somebody and you look at their laptop computer and a sticky note is sitting on there with a password right on their computer. So one of the things that occurred in the JP Morgan matter, they believe that the login credentials of one of the JP Morgan employees was actually stolen, and they utilized those login credentials to get access to the system. And we're talking about, numbers in the areas of $1 billion in potential losses. And part of that number is, oftentimes it's penalties they have to pay. It's having to pay now for credit screening or credit monitoring for the individuals that are affected by it. All those things now have to take place. Another one that I thought was really interesting was the Anthem hack. And unfortunately, we don't really know exactly what that cost, but there's speculation in the industry that's anywhere between $8 billion to $16 billion in losses as a result of this particular event. And in this scenario, it is theorized that it was a high-level IT employees systems that were either they were based upon a phishing scam, they were tricked into giving up their login credentials and passwords. But you imagine if the IT people can't recognize that there's a potential problem, how are we supposed to ensure that all of our employees know how to better deal with situations where we have an email coming in that says, hey, this is happening, please fill out this little form, and making sure that they understand the integrity of the data and how they have to monitor and manage their information. So the next thing we wanted to do is kind of move on a little bit here to talking a little bit about these data breach statistics. So there's a couple of surveys out there that we wanted to share with you. The first one is from the Ponemon Institute from last year, and they said the cost per breach had gone to about $3.79 million as of last year, and that's a 23% increase over 2013. So I can't even imagine what we're going to start seeing as we move, as history moves along and we start actually having more and more data breaches occurring. So somehow we either have to shore up our systems, provide better education and training to our employees, but also to make people more aware about doing a better job about cleaning up the information that we have. So as ugly as e-discovery has been for the industry, one of the things that it's shown a very bright light on is the fact that about 60% of the data that we maintain in our organizations is either, old information or even employees' personal garbage. So, those honey pickup milk emails is like one of my favorite examples, or those vacation photographs from all the employees. So a way to make sure that that kind of information doesn't get impinged upon is the fact don't have it. So that's one of the things I think it will help to reduce those overall costs. Additionally,
I would add to that.
Absolutely.
Too. The point about storing data that you don't need or use anymore. I mean, we just went through an exercise in my company where we had to clean house day, right? And we had to clean out our SharePoint sites because you literally had data there that had been stored for 10 years. So there's definitely a need to clean house, as you said.
Absolutely. And it's hard, right? So if you have to have every employee do that, Number one, there's a cost to the organization, especially some of the larger companies, right? If it takes them 15 minutes a day to keep their data cleaned up, there is a cost associated with being able to do that. So one of the statistics that I ran for one of my clients a few years ago, and the numbers came out to, like, if you took 10,000 employees and they spent 15 minutes a day just keeping their workstations cleaned up, keeping their data stores cleaned up, and assuming a blended hourly rate of roughly $20 an hour, and of course keeping in mind that's not just their wages, right? That includes their benefits package, et cetera. And that $20 an hour is pretty doggone low considering if you took it across most organizations. But it comes up to $12.5 million in lost productivity time. So it's a considerable number. So organizations today are really starting to look at technology to be able to manage that and not have to have the employees do so much of it.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really interesting point. So I mean, a few different numbers you threw out there. So more and more organizations are having these house cleaning days, if you will, where you gave the stat of 15 minutes a day, which isn't unreasonable for employees to look at their information. You're looking at $12.5 million of cost every year. Sort of puts that Sony comment about $10 million for a security breach into perspective. But Roberta, I was wondering if you might be able to jump in. I mean, just as Linda was talking about that, the idea of relying on employees, especially at these large organizations, you look at that billion dollar issue that JP Morgan ran into. Well, if they're supporting 240,000 employees worldwide, employee training, things like that only gets you so far. So I mean, where does technology sort of come in? And I mean, how can you actually, because a lot of these internal data breaches actually happen by mistake. It's not even necessarily a bad Apple employee or what have you. So, in your experience, what are some of the things from a technology perspective that organizations can start looking at, to try to minimize the impact of an internal breach? Oh, we might be running into a bit of a technical difficulty here. So, Jen and Linda, I'm not sure if you caught my question, but maybe you'd be able to speak to it a little bit.
This is Jen. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we often do in our company, I mean, we try to design with security in mind. And so what that means a lot of times is deciding who has to have access to information or databases and who doesn't. So you don't design it. In the past, many years ago, you would have designed it so your entire IT team had access to things. And now, you need to put controls in place so that, it's not a free-for-all, as it were. And so that only people who really have a need to know have access to whether it's data or systems. So just a smarter design, I think, is one way.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, but obviously making sure that only the individuals who need to have access to that information have access. So, a perfect example is a company goes out and runs, a new marketing campaign on a brand new product launch. Access to that information needs to be done by both the legal team, the business units, the marketing department, and that might hold true during that short little window of time. But as time moves forward, maybe the business users still need access to that information because they're still working on whatever that product is, but maybe the marketing department really shouldn't have access to that information anymore. So how do we ensure that we only have access to information that we have a specific need for at that single point in time? Just because I need access today doesn't mean I should be able to continue to have access to that information. So making sure we're shoring that up.
I think that's actually a fantastic point and a really good segue, Linda, that people sort of look at it sometimes black and white, that, hey, do I need to keep the data or can I get rid of the data, from an organizational perspective, when in reality it's exactly what you said. It actually comes down to a much more granular control of access privileges and access rights. It's not just about, are we keeping the data, are we getting rid of the data? Even if we are keeping the data, and for good reason, we still need to make sure that we're limiting who has access to it and that we're very granular about that type of control, which again is where sometimes technologies come into play, because to your point about, some of these breaches and these internal breaches that are being caused by employees, the more employees that have access to data, or the more data they have access to, the impact of that breach is going to be that much bigger. And I think to sort of round out the point, I mean, Jen, if you want to, talk a little bit about, some of these larger breaches we've seen, and Linda, please jump in here as well. But, how do you see sort of these breaches differing across industries and sort of the variable side you see in terms of the impact?
Well, I think the thing that jumps out at me is, first of all, just the size of the number of records and the dollar amounts involved in terms of just cutting across every spectrum. You see everything from Dow Corning to a Coca-Cola, and then of course the medical NRAD medical associates. So just the dollar volumes are just enormous. And then also just the number of records, which shows you, again, the ability to store information is easier than it's ever been. And so the volume that we're storing, which again hits on Linda's point about the need to occasionally clean house and eliminate data.
Great, great. And this was, this is one of my favorite slide titles. It's not them, it's us. So sort of talking again about, what can we do internally within the organization to really minimize this. So Jen, I'm going to toss this one back to you. I mean, if you want to cover this in a little bit more detail.
This was just eye-opening to me that the Ponemon Countertrack 2016 survey that they did, 81% of respondents said that the biggest challenge they face is minimizing the threat of negligent or careless employees. And we're talking about here people who are just not following their security policies. And then that same survey, the respondents also said that the threats being caused by malware infections that are more stealth and increasingly more difficult to detect. And so amongst that, again, these internal data breaches are really the most common type of breach. And we're talking, when you think about the number of devices, and we've got another slide later on, that I think the average number of devices that an individual has access to is 6 different connected devices. And Linda and I were talking before, just the ability to work from home now, and data is so transportable. So if I have a flash drive or a thumb drive, you might refer to it, the ability for me to extract data from my computer and take it with me and work from home if I'm working from home. I think, Linda, you said you worked from home for over 20 years, and there's no one coming and monitoring you at your desk, per se, unless there's technology controls in place. But just the ease with which we can actually, remove data now or obviously infect a system. And, they all have, these types of systems all have one thing in common. It's where many of the users have access to administration rights to the company server or their web apps. And these are the people that are working on the system, developing them, or potentially importing or exporting personal information or customer information if the users have access. So this, again, I think calls for the need of, proper controls in place as to who has access. Do you have policies and practices in place about things like the use of removable drives? Or are you using systems that, where your users don't have laptops, they have access to a desktop? Anything you would add, Linda?
No, I think that's a great point. So as we look at the industry evolve from a technology standpoint, right, we're getting more and more access to information. So whether we're talking about the Internet of Things, we're talking about BYOD, we're far more connected now than we've ever been, obviously in the history of the world, because technology is evolving. So we have to make sure that we're planning not just for where we are today, but where do we plan to go 5 years from now? What are we looking at? And obviously making sure that as we implement those processes, that we're taking into consideration about new technologies that are coming out every single day.
Now, I guess I want to add too, so we talked about the sort of what we refer to here as the innocuous breach. Then you've got instances of the purposeful breach, whether you're referring to Edward Snowden or whether you're talking, more recently in the news, I think we've all seen or been reading about the Panama Papers incident, right? And so that, again, was an internal source leaking just a huge amount of information, basically 2.6 terabytes of data, which, in layman's terms, we're really talking about 11.5 million leaked papers with 40 years worth of financial information, contact names, and these were companies who were actually helping set up and create offshore entities. So just a huge impact across the globe. related or further down from that, another type of impact can be phishing or spear phishing. So where you've got a user that's duped into revealing some sort of a confidential information or perhaps installing malware. I think we've all gotten emails from the Nigerian prince or princess. Then the more targeted spear phishing that's really targeting a specific organization. We had an email about 2 months ago that our IT team caught, security team caught, but it appears to come from a trusted source. And if you go to my LinkedIn page, you could probably pretty easily see who my boss is or who the CIO or CEO is of my company. And it's really relying on social media. So people have amazing amounts of information at their fingertips to actually be able to target a company with emails that look very real.
That's really a great point. I have to tell this little story, and it's kind of almost even embarrassing because I've been in the industry for such a long time. But I actually got an email from Kohl's, Kohl's department store, and I printed it off and I took it down there, and they wanted me to, click on this button to come out and get this free award. Well, I decided not to do that. I actually took it into my local Kohl's store and said, hey, what do I need to do to get this award? And they started looking at it, and they realized that it actually wasn't from Kohl's. So if you really looked into it in more detail, you could tell that it really was not a Kohl's communication. So it's one of those where how easy it is to be tricked, because I just looked at it on my phone, right? So I didn't see the whole email address. I just saw Kohl's pop up. And I happened to be out shopping that day and popped by Kohl's. But, other individuals could be very, very easily, tricked into not realizing what it was that just came into the environment.
Right,
okay.
Right. No, and I think that, Linda, thanks for rounding that point out. I mean, as we can see on the slide, I mean, Jen, what you were talking about, the connectivity risk, just how interconnected data is, and with the number of portable devices we have, obviously how quickly that information gets out is also a lot more expansive than it was just a few years ago. But talking about, a little bit more about the sensitive data, I mean, how do organizations actually, figure out what data do they really need to go after? How do they find it? How do they actually secure it? If that's one area that you could speak to a little bit, Jen, I mean, what is the information that needs to be protected outside of obviously the traditional PII, PCI, PHI that comes to mind for most of us?
Right, and what we're really talking about here is protecting information and even the systems that store the information, right, from unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction. And your ultimate goal there is to provide data that has integrity, so you're guarding against the improper modification or destruction of data, so including things like non-repudiation, so that you can ensure, like for example, when you get a contract or a communication from someone that's been signed, you know that it's authentic and that the data, the signature matches the underlying document or contract. Also the concept of confidentiality, basically preserving and managing authorized restrictions on access and disclosure of the data. So those, again, who have a need to have access to it can and do, but it's not open to the world in terms of having access to something. And then also availability. So again, those who actually do need to have access to some data, they've got reliable access to it and can use it as needed or as approved. So, there's a tendency to believe that only personally identifiable information, such as like social security numbers, passport numbers, or medical records, are the types of data that need protection. That's really not the case. I mean, many types of data have value and should be kept, maintained, and destroyed securely. So, a lot in terms of the types of data you might have will be very dependent upon the industry in which you work, as well as your geographical location or the location of your data to determine, what laws and regulations actually do apply. Obviously, in the U.S. context, information that can be used on its own or with other information to identify a contact or a single person is really what we're talking about in terms of personally identifiable information. The payment card industry obviously has, data related to debit cards, credit cards, cash card transactions, and they had, that industry in about 2004 actually went and created their data security standards, which is interesting because it's an industry standard, and it's, to be able to accept credit cards and credit cards, you need to be able to meet the standards set up by the data security standard in the payment card industry. Things like, again, intellectual property. You know, the FBI has done a report where they show, you know, law departments and law firms are actually more vulnerable because of the types of data they have access to, M&A activities, business plans, future developments, et cetera. So with that, I'm trying to be cognizant of our time. I think I covered all the basics there.
No, I think you did. I think that was really helpful, Jen, and I'm also going to rush us along a little bit in the discussion just to make sure we can cover the remaining slides and also get to some of the takeaways here for our audience. So, you know, having talked a little bit about, you know, all those different data types or data categories within sensitive information, Linda, if you could speak to a little bit about, you know, how do you actually go about finding this data, right? So we'd all love to have some magical tool that goes and tells us all this stuff, but I mean, if I'm sitting in the organization, I know this data is out there, what are some of the concrete steps I can take right now to really figure out where that data is located?
So one of the most important things to do is really, you know, have a process in place whereby you go through and done some kind of an audit within your organization of actually talking to the end users. Oftentimes what we see is they'll come in and they'll actually meet with IT, and IT will talk about, oh yes, everybody has access to a file share. But then when you start diving down into it, you might discover that, you know, 10% of the population of the organization actually don't use their file share. They store everything on their local laptop or on their desktop. So it's really important to make sure that you truly understand where that data physically sits. And in addition to that, also identify where they store their information. So certain business units, for example, might have a need for exporting information. There was a case not too terribly long ago where there was sensitive information within the organization. It was actually government type data, and they were not allowed to export that information. Well, unfortunately, the accounting department decided that they needed some additional resources and assistance and were exporting information to a third-party provider, not realizing they were actually in breach of a contract dealing with that specific information. So it's not enough to assume that everybody understands, because it's also very well intended, just trying to get their job done, not realizing that kind of information should not leave the organization. If the data does leave the organization, identify where that data sits, knowing what those risks are, conducting ongoing security audits potentially based upon the type of information that might be. So are you utilizing a third-party provider? Is data sitting in a cloud environment? Are you hosting information for e-discovery purposes? Is that with a third-party provider or the law firm? All these different things we have to be thinking about based upon the kinds of information that we have. So for example, some companies may have a policy of certain types of information can be, you know, pushed out to a cloud or to a third-party provider, but other types of information cannot. Are you running some kind of ongoing audit to ensure that in fact that policy is being followed and that all the employees understand? Having worked in the past for, you know, very large organizations, I mean, on an annual basis, you know, we would get that 500-page manual that we all had to sign off saying that we fully read and understand the manual, and a big chunk of that manual was the security policy of the company. Well, unfortunately, if you actually spent the time to read that security policy, you could spend the next month trying to decipher what exactly it meant if you could even read the whole thing. So making sure that those policies are easy and clear for employees to understand what exactly they're supposed to be doing. Number two, looking at those data sources, identifying what those sources are, where they're physically located, and what are our risks associated with those sources. So for example, if a number of these items have, you know, very, very high or reasons in which we have to maintain this information confidential. What types of information, based upon the nature of your organization, do you have to truly manage? And then really making sure that there is a process in place to ensure that that gets done. And another thing to kind of think in mind too, as we move on to item number 3, and I apologize if I'm talking fairly quickly, but we want to get through some of this content, is looking at what you have. So for example, one of the big black holes that we've seen are those file shares. You know, they've become the dumping ground. A lot of companies have now moved on to SharePoint, and I think it's kind of taking on a little bit of that same model as well. But the old file shares that we've seen out there for such a long time, you'll talk to a customer and, you know, they've had data sitting out there for 10 or 15 years, have absolutely no idea what's in it, how they're going to decipher that information, and then basically utilizing technology to try to find out what you have in there, whether you're looking at a basic metadata analysis or something more of a content analysis. So, for example, the metadata analysis would allow you to, glean out of that, how old is this information? What kinds of files am I having? What kind of data types do I have in that data store? Is there a way that I can quickly start cutting information out? So, for example, if my longest retention policy is 10 years, but I have data in there going back 15 years, maybe I can get rid of some of this. But basically getting a better understanding of what exactly do you have. Jen, did you want to add anything to that before we move on to the next slide?
No, I think you covered it well.
Okay, thank you. Also, too, then even identifying of that information, what's left. So you've cut the wheat from the chaff, you've gotten rid of all the junk, and now maybe what you want to do is more of a content-based analysis and identify, what's in here that I really do need to keep and what do I not need to keep. So as we start looking, as part of that, you're going to be identifying what's in here that's my sensitive data. Is there information in here that I really shouldn't have anymore? Do I have the proper processes and audit trails put in place to ensure that only specific individuals or groups of individuals have access to the specific type of information that we have? And so you can't do that if you don't have any idea what's sitting in those shares. So managing information or sensitive data, you want to, obviously we just talked about remediation, classify what information you could potentially get rid of versus what you need to keep. If it's information you need to keep for either a regulatory requirement or a business requirement, ensuring that you have the proper protections in place to monitor and manage that data. The next thing you want to do is obviously apply access privileges. And those access privileges are going to change based upon where the individual sits in the organization and the company's process. So obviously every 6 months or some kind of timed period, you want to make sure that you have a process in place where you go back and actually revisit what that process needs to look like. Maybe you've made a determination, the example I gave previously, marketing has access for 3 years, the business team's 5 years, and maybe legal 10 years. Maybe at some point that changes. Maybe you only want to give marketing access for 2 years. What's the process for ensuring that those privileges have now been invoked on your data? And then obviously too, handling audit trails, making sure that you have a way of truly auditing exactly what you've done, what you did, why you did it, who was engaged in the process, and whether or not the technology can provide any kind of an audit trail as to who's accessed information. Can I track that a particular individual is getting information they really shouldn't be accessing? Or maybe they're sending out large, amounts of information outside of the organization that they shouldn't be doing. The ways of utilizing technology to be able to do this. Unfortunately, we're creating way too much information. There's no way we can rely on human beings to be able to do all of this. So we're going to have to rely on technology.
Great.
Jen, you want to add anything?
I guess, and I think you may get to these three at the end, but just, you can see this, and people really shouldn't be overwhelmed by this, right? Because there are systematic ways to deal with this information. And so I'm eager to hear about our move forward strategies.
Okay, great. No, thanks a lot, Jen. And Jen and Linda, both of you for the discussion today. It's unfortunate I wasn't able to join us due to a last-minute commitment. But we did want to cover sort of the move forward strategies and some of the takeaways from the discussion today. I'm going to do my best to try to summarize some of these key points, but please feel free to jump in. So obviously one of the first things we talked about was making sure that we actually have a program in place that's comprehensive enough to address not just day-to-day security, but what do you do in the case of a data breach? How do we make sure that there's ongoing education to our human capital in terms of how they need to behave, how they need to protect their data, and how they need to address internal security issues by having a longer-term governance focus and approach. I sort of liken it a lot to what my doctor always tells me, that these one-time diets to suddenly drop 10 pounds never work. The thing that you need to do is permanently change your diet over the long term so that you're able to maintain a healthier lifestyle. It's sort of the same thing. It's not just how do we take care of that breach that just happened and how do we minimize the damage, but are we really putting a program in place that allows our employees and our organization to govern our information better in the long term so that when a data breach does occur, one, the impact of it is minimized, the chances of it being an internal data breach are minimized, and we already have proactive policies and procedures in place to be able to address that as aggressively as we can. You know, a second key point that both Jen and Linda emphasized was, you know, making sure that we have the ability to not only detect when the stuff is happening and hopefully get ahead of it, but having a response plan in place. So, you know, going back to that, you know, comprehensive program, not only is it about the long-term governance, but when a data breach does occur, how do we make sure that, you know, both from a technical and policies and procedures standpoint, we are well prepared to make sure we you know, address some of those data breaches? Because again, you know, two of the really key points that Linda and Jen kept emphasizing, almost half of these data breaches end up being internal, where it's actually something an internal employee did or did not do that caused sensitive information to get exposed. And what's even more interesting about that is the majority of those cases were actually negligence. It's actually not employees going out maliciously trying to expose data or, you know, leaving, you know, giving passwords out or anything like that. A lot of the time it is negligence. You know, Linda gave the example of the accounting department, you know, trying to get their job done, working with an outside vendor and inadvertently breaching a contract. It's not enough just to, you know, train our employees, but to make sure that we're also enabling them with, you know, technologies that that help secure a lot of this data for them. So Linda, you talked a lot about file analysis, where, you know, one of the things we're seeing more and more activity around is what we call the infamous, you know, corporate dumping ground, which is your file shares. So much data, you know, there's a slide that where we covered the different data breaches and how, depending on the industry, the impact was, you know, from a cost perspective, was very different. Obviously, if you're in the healthcare industry and you've got all this, you know, health information and PII sitting out on your file shares, that's completely different than, you know, say you're in manufacturing. But the commonality is that file shares continue to be one of the unfortunate breeding grounds, if you will, of a lot of these breaches, because all of this data is just sitting out there. And the really scary part is we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what data is out there, so it's really hard to, you know, come up with a policy-based action to actually remediate it. So that's where, again, where Linda emphasized, you know, making sure we really get an inventory of what our information is, understanding what those different data sources are, and then using technology to target them both from a metadata and content perspective to actually start to classify and remediate some of that information. And that's really the concept of overall file governance and data governance, that, you know, in order to have a comprehensive strategy to address some of these cybersecurity and internal data issues, it's not just about the security team coming up with a bunch of security technologies or the governance folks coming up with policies. It really has to be a joint effort where each one of these things needs to be looked at with all stakeholders at the table to be able to address not only the security aspect, but also ensure that it lines up with the broader data governance strategy. So with that, I want to pass it over to Jen or Linda if you have any closing comments. We are running a little bit over time here, so we'll wrap up after this. But any closing comments, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Well, Jen, let me go ahead. Jen, I'll go ahead. This is Linda, guys. So one of the things we have to really kind of keep in mind, I'm a firm believer in the phrase fail to plan, plan to fail. So if we don't have a process in place on how we're going to manage this information that continues to grow at exponential rates, it's going to drown us. So we have to start looking at what we can get rid of, what's the process for being able to do that, and what is in fact our go-forward strategy. Because unfortunately, I don't want to revisit this again 3 years from now. So making sure that there is a process in place for how you plan to move forward.
So we are opening it up for Q&A. So if you do have any questions, you know, please feel free to send them in via the GoToWebinar chat. I know we ran a little bit over time, so we will be taking additional questions at zl_info@zlti.com. Jen and Linda, again, thank you so much for joining us today. Everyone that attended, we very much appreciate your time. We'll look forward to responding to your questions, and don't hesitate to reach out for anything else. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful afternoon.